So I'm really excited to announce my two fellow panelists. The first is Glenn Solomon, who's a managing partner at GGV Capital. He joined in 2006 and focuses on enterprise cloud and infrastructure investing. I'm not going to let him off so easy, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the investments that he's led and the journeys that he's been a part of. He led GGV's investments in Zendesk, Square, SuccessFactors, Slack, which is really incredible. And then on the private side, he's an investor in Coder, HashiCorp, Tray.io, and Kong, which is why he's on this panel with me. And then the second panelist is Martin Casado. He's a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz. And he was previously the co-founder and CTO at Nicira, which was acquired by VMware for $1.26 billion. So he's been on, if there are founders in the room, on that side of the table as well, which I always think makes for a more colorful discussion. And while at VMware, he served as senior VP, where he scaled the unit to a $600 million run rate, which is awesome. And so what we kind of want to expose to you here is just a discussion on kind of general trends, talk about open source, because as investors, the reason why we do this job is to see what's going to happen 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, and reflect on kind of the trends that have already taken place. And so the first thing that's usually on my mind, and I've talked to Martine and Glenn about it, is open source always existed. It's nothing new. But in 2018, as we sat around the table, we realized it was a very pivotal year for open source. And it was pivotal because you had these very large, valuable transactions that took place that showed, hey, these open source businesses can be very value accretive. And so examples of that was Elastic and Pivotal and their IPO, and then Red Hat getting acquired, which was the largest software acquisition that ever happened. And this is sort of a high-level question, but I'd love Glenn and Martine's responses of why 2018? Like, what was about that year that was an inflection point where we first saw open source sort of be a commercial hit? Maybe Glenn, I'll ask you first, and Martine, please chime in.
So thanks, Anna. I think it's a great question, and I think while 2018 looks like it was the, you guys hear me okay? It looks like it was the culmination of, or it looks like it was a big year. I think it was a culmination of a major trend in open source that has been gradually gaining steam over a long period of time. On the panel before lunch, Preeti from HashiCorp mentioned, I think really rightly, that open source lowers risk dramatically for companies who are adopting software. At the practitioner level, sorry, this is, can you guys hear me okay if I just speak like this? Yes? No?
No.
Okay, I'll try to speak into this boom. So I think what Preeti said was, hey, it lowers risk, and therefore it makes a lot of sense for people to try open source. Whether if you're a developer, if you're a practitioner, certainly that's the first place you look, and I think that's been going on now for a while. And so if you look at the growth in the communities and the projects and their popularity, it's really been going on now for some time. I think the connection to commercial business models has taken longer to figure out, but there has been some good invention. Thanks. Sorry about that. Is that better? Okay. So there's been good invention, and I know we're going to talk about that, but I think it's the connection between open source as a great answer for how software should be developed and then how software should be utilized, coupled with, hey, we figured out how to build a commercial strategy out of open source that has led to more interest, therefore acquisitions and IPOs, and I think it's just the beginning. I think we'll look back on 2018 as a quaint little year in open source at some point.
Awesome. Martine, what do you think?
So I agree with that. So I think I'd add one thing, which is I think open source is always kind of constrained by like the creativity of the market and the size of the market. So if you look back maybe 15 years, a lot of the open source successes were entering mature markets with kind of Me Too products because they had to. So if you're doing some kind of funky open source project that nobody knew how to think about, like maybe you'd get like a little community, but you wouldn't get a lot of adoption in the enterprise. And so, listen, Linux went after Unix, MySQL went after Oracle, Android went after the iPhone movement, and you have like a bunch of examples of companies that were basically commoditizers. But then as the entire industry got more mature and developers got more control of budget and people got more sophisticated about thinking about things, all of a sudden open source went from, I'm going to do what this big company does, but I'm going to do it in open source, to I'm going to do this entirely new thing in an entirely new paradigm, and I'm going to educate you on that. I think that allowed companies to do kind of pre-chasm early market startups and be successful without being constrained by these kind of older markets. And I think that breakout probably happened around 2010 to 2012. And so 2018 is like the maturation of those companies that started in the last decade or so.
Got it. No, that makes sense. And then I want to touch on something you said, Glenn, which is commercial open source starting to become successful. And what do you think, if you were to pinpoint certain values that lead to that, what would you say those are? And if you could give examples from kind of your own experiences as a board member, that would be really helpful.
Sure. Well, let's talk about what's been hard. Winning the hearts and minds either in replacement technologies or brand new technologies has been, I think, open source has really blazed a trail that has probably nowhere to go now but continuing forward. Like, we will continue to see open source as a very, very important trend in software and software development for years to come. If you think about where the dollars lie in your companies, if you work for a larger enterprise, though, decision makers tend to be somewhat distant from practitioners, from developers, from users of technology. And so I can remember just a couple of years ago talking to a CIO panel with whom I liaised frequently and asked them about, hey, how many in your organizations, how many of you guys have open source? And there were no hands went up. And I knew for a fact that many of those companies had lots of open source. They probably all had lots of open source, and they just didn't know about it. And so connecting those dots has been the challenge. And I think what companies like Kong have helped invent, this is really new science. This is not something that's been going on for years. It's really just been going on for the last couple of years, is figuring out, okay, how do I cater to the needs of a community and do so with rigor and with serious resource and maintaining a commitment, and at the same time build a bridge to the decision makers who will ultimately want to spend money with us as a company because they know that if our technology succeeds, they'll succeed, and so they want us to succeed as a business too, otherwise the technology may go away. And so there's that I think now that there's been enough companies that have closed that loop successfully, you're starting to see more follow, and now companies themselves are more accustomed to dealing with open source and then like maybe an open core model. We're going to talk about models in a second, but the routinization of buying from a company that also provides me with open source software has become more legitimate in larger enterprise. And so I think we're in that process. Companies like Kong are doing a very good job connecting those dots, but it's still very early.
And you think those two groups are actually quite different? Like, do you think that, let's say, one of you have started a compelling open source project, and you have to think about managing the community, but also managing the eventual buyer. In some companies, I was lucky enough to work very early on with Twilio, that is one and the same. But have you seen that those can actually be different communities? And so it's about managing the open source community, but then also getting to a different buyer that is making the decision.
Take that one?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of interesting. Even outside of open source, one of the biggest trends in the industry is like startups have to learn to kind of like walk and chew gum in the following ways. Which is, it used to be the case if you're building an enterprise company, like you'd build some cool new thing and it solved some problem, and then you'd build a sales force, and you'd take that sales force and you'd go and sell it. And that was kind of a contract that you had with the buyer. But more and more, the fastest growing companies actually have these kind of bottoms-up organic phenomenons that win by brand. I mean, think about like Slack or GitHub or Dropbox or Atlassian. It took a long time before they actually built out sales, and instead they kind of won, like they built great products and they had great brand and they had the great marketing channels. And this whole industry trend was actually kind of created by open source. Like open source was like, listen, we're going to use the bits themselves of the product as a marketing channel, and then companies will use it, and then over time we'll have this huge user base and we can sell into that. So that works if you're able to build a community, but the problem is let's say you're building this great community and you've got all these developers and everybody's using it, then you have to now build sales. And if you do that in a way that you erode your bottom-up growth, you have a failed company. And so where the enterprise in the past used to be, I just worry about sales, and like consumer companies in the past, like I'll just worry about marketing-based growth. Now these enterprise companies, especially open source companies, have to do both growth and sales. And that, and the interplay between those two graphs has been very, very difficult. And so I think the one piece of advice I'd give for anybody that's thinking about doing this or thinking through this is, as far as we can tell, so we're at Andreessen Horowitz, we invest in a lot of open source companies. As far as we can tell, there is no path to a successful company without having a successful community. There's absolutely no path. Now, if you don't happen to get sales working, you get a lot of shots on goals, like let's say you try and it doesn't work, or you do it slowly, that's all fine. And so you have to prioritize community, you have to prioritize the product, and then over time you build out the sales. And so I do think these things are actually very different. I think actually dealing with them together is quite complicated. But if you take your eye off of open source and the community, you will have a failed company.
That reminds me of something Augie likes to say. He taught me this in saying that there's a huge difference between users. Don't confuse users with a community.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's a really important part of this puzzle that Martin mentions. If the community isn't strong, then you have no shot at building an open source business that you can commercialize. So it has to start there. But that in and of itself doesn't guarantee you success in commercialization. So to touch on the question you raised, I do think that it tends to be, as Martin alluded to, it's a different, like enterprise selling is still enterprise selling. If you come in bottoms up through practitioners with open source, that really helps build that bottoms up love and a real desire. You probably have good champions in the org, but you've still then got to do the enterprise selling thing, and that is not easy. It takes, those of you who work in large organizations know, you may be championing a product, but then you've got procurement and legal and contracting, and it's just a very difficult process.
Yep. And when you guys talk about community, I've had a number of founders kind of call me out on this, so I'm going to call you guys out on it, which is how do you know when you have that community? Because community, in a sense, is almost like measuring brand. Like when a founder comes to you and says, I think I have a really strong community, I'm going to try to commercialize it, how can we verify that? Is it GitHub stars and reviews? Is it active instances? Is it number of downloads? I mean, how can someone know that they have something special brewing?
Yeah. So I'm going to not answer the question. I'm going to let Glanton answer the question, but I'm going to answer a related question, which is the following. So in the investor community, there's this great calculus for looking at consumer companies, which has been evolved over the last 10 years. And it's a lot of acronyms like I don't even really know, like MAUs and DAOs and engagement and smile curves and all this other stuff. But the important thing to realize is that people have looked at these companies for 20 years. They looked at Snapchat and they looked at Twitter, and they're like, okay, we understand how these like cohorts grow and how the users grow and how the communities grow. They really get it. And as far as I can tell, with open source, we just don't know. Like the calculus doesn't exist. And so everybody has these first order approximations, right? We see these things like GitHub stars and mailing lists and downloads. But if you actually look at the data, so we've done the analysis on this, and we're in the middle of doing the analysis. If you actually look at the data from like sales, growth, outcomes, and then all these vanity metrics, there's almost no correlation. So I believe that the answer is out there. I believe there's a calculus to be made that is actually meaningful that you can use to your business. I just don't know what that is yet, and I think a lot of people don't. So that's kind of my non-answer for what I actually think is a very complicated question.
Yeah. So would your suggestion, and then I'm going to let you answer too, be that just continue to try to put out a great product, get the community to help you, and then maybe you hit that community success and maybe you don't?
So I've got a quick, so there's one thing I would say, which is the organic growth of an open source product needs to be self-fulfilling. Like, people have to want to use it, and it has to be solving a problem, and it has to speak for itself. And that should have secondary follow-on effects, like people like you. Like, they want your product. They want to talk to you. They follow up. And so I think from a company standpoint, you want to look at those second-order effects. Are people reaching out to me? I don't care what my GitHub stars. Are they reaching out to me and they want to know more? Are they coming in? Are they asking for pricing? That's the only real metric of community value. The thing is, from an investor standpoint, you're like, okay. Like, so it's very hard from the outside to know, but I do think you have some pretty concrete inbounds from like a project manager or a product manager.
Yeah.
Well, when you guys figure it out, can you?
We'll do it together.
The thing that I would say from my experience so far has been that community building is very different company to company. You're never at the finish line. It is a process as much as it is, a way to set goals for yourself. But for those of you thinking about starting some open source projects in the future, and/or those of you who just are active users of open source and trying to figure out, well, should I spend my time with this project because I like it, but is it going to die because it doesn't look like there's, much activity around it? One thing I've seen is that it can take a long, long time for some of these projects to gestate. Kong has been very successful with its open source gateway and has millions of downloads a month at this point. But there are lots of projects that are now successful, but that had many years of, let's say, fallow times. And so I think it has a lot to do with, if I was thinking about, not from an investor standpoint, but from a user standpoint, trying to understand, hey, should I invest time in this open source project? Is it going to be around a while? I'd look pretty closely at the founders. And hey, how committed are the founders to this project? Are they spending lots of time in the forums and trying to answer questions? Are they listening to all the suggestions? Is the community beginning to build? What does the contributions look like? What's going on with the PRs? And ultimately make some determination not on like a vanity metric, hey, there's not enough GitHub stars, but more like, do I believe in the vision as articulated by the founders of this project, and do they seem to have motives that are in line with my motives for wanting to use the project? And I think if those things add up, it's probably a pretty good bet.
Yeah. I think we gave some sort of answer to that question, which I feel good about. So I think we can switch gears now to, you touched on this a little bit, Glenn, business models. So once you have that community, some X factor is working, what are the business models and commercial open source that both of you have seen to be successful? So which ones have worked? And then, without calling out certain companies, which ones do you think have not worked? And what would be some of your advice for the room?
Let me have a go? All right. So listen, Glenn's a better investor than I am, so he's going to give you a more complete answer. So let me give you my high level. I actually don't worry about this question. Like, I just think that open source had a tough time monetizing previously because just companies weren't sophisticated buyers. They didn't think they needed a relationship with a company, which is just stupid, right? If you're getting a bunch of bits and those bits are changing over time, you're definitely going to want to have some relationship with a company, and that is formalized as a sales relationship. And the maturation of that has been enormous over the last few years. I also think we've really perfected open source as a service. And it's really hard to run a large operational cloud service. This is something that is more of an operations problem than a code problem. And I think so any company entering the space that actually has a service offering that can monetize. And so I personally spend less time being is this monetizable, cannibalization, blah, blah, blah. And I'm listen, is this cool? Is it solving a problem? Do people like it? If yes, I'm all for it. If not, then the decision kind of answers itself.
Okay, I'll take a slightly different tact on this one and say that to me, it seems like the models I've seen develop, like, if I put them into a couple of buckets, there are companies that are what I kind of consider to be pure open core models, where they have open source pieces of software and then want to sell enterprise features, many of which you'll run yourself in VPCs or on-prem or pick your environment. And that seems to be, like, again, it resembles traditional software models in terms of how those commercial features get sold. But I think that's where you're seeing most of the traction today. Again, it's still early days, but I suspect we'll see more of this. As software has gotten more complex and more workloads have moved to the cloud, I think that more of these companies are now also providing, like, running the service themselves for you. The trick with that, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about it, is, okay, if you run the service and it's open source, who else can run the service in open source and try to commercialize that service as well? So there's, but depending on the product itself and how important it is to you, how difficult it is to run, and I see, like, the kind of, call it the on-prem or the VPC option, and then the cloud service option of open source. To me, those are both very viable models, and companies are running hybrids of both as well. I think that the days of betting on companies that just provide support as, like, another model, a little less attractive, I think, just from a financial standpoint, and more difficult to scale. And then lastly, I'd say I do see lots of companies that pursue some sort of embedded model with open source, going back to, like, MySQL as a one of maybe the pioneers in that world, and that can make sense. It can make sense, and I think we'll see companies succeed with that model going forward.
Makes sense. And then we did talk about, if you have a model that's working, what prevents another company from also selling that open source? And so the gorilla in the room, to touch on Kong's logo as well, is AWS. And that comes up a lot in my discussions with founders, because they seem to be getting in a lot of areas and threatening some very viable open source companies, but they're not really being successful at much yet in that arena. If you are a founder, how should you think about AWS? How do both of you think about AWS?
Yeah, so again, I've got a pretty simplistic view of this. Which is, like, I feel like after every reInvent, I'm on maybe 15 boards, after every reInvent, I kind of, like, move from, like, kind of VC to, like, therapist. I'm like, no, it's okay. Like, they just say they're going to do this thing, like, whatever. And, like, I honestly think being afraid of AWS is like being afraid of HP. Like, HP is a great company. They do great things. But listen, this is a $1 trillion market, of which every independent subsector is tens of billions of dollars, which needs entire companies and product teams and sales forces that understand how to sell the value and everything else. And, like, I honestly can't think of a single company, and it's so fun. Like, as a VC, by the way, we're like these pattern matchers, and we often say these stupid things, and one of the stupid things we always say is, like, what if AWS does this? And we've been saying this for 10 years, and I have a hard time thinking about a company that AWS has actually put out of business by doing open source. Like, maybe you had pricing pressure or something. So my view is this: AWS is fantastic. It's a commoditizing force. They're going to, if something's successful, they're going to do, like, a crappy version of it, and, like, that's totally fine, and that will evolve over time. But if you're adding something of value that's differentiated, and you have an R&D team, like, take Kong, for example, you're going to build a great company. And I think we should just stop honestly worrying about that and just focus on, like, adding value and building out these big enterprise companies. But just, I'm very much a minority view in VC on this, but, like, that's kind of my learned view.
But maybe to push back just slightly on that and ask maybe a slightly harder question. We talked about community and how hard that is to build. You could say that AWS, in a sense, has a bulletproof community. And if you think that that is what allows open source to commercialize the fastest, you have great distribution, you have the hearts and minds of a developer, then they truly are miles ahead of other open source projects. Does that worry you, or would you stand by the same answer?
I mean, I'm just very quick, I don't mean to, like, that's for me is like saying Facebook has got a great community. Facebook's got a great community. It has nothing to do with my community, but like, that's a great community. Listen, people use AWS, and people use Cisco, and people use HP, and people use VMware, and they use all of these things, and it's all great. However, they have two pizza box teams that are focusing on these interesting, on these different projects, and some are good and some are not good, and they allow, 1,000 flowers to bloom and many die on the vine, to like mix metaphors. And I actually think that, listen, with $1 trillion IT market, people want real interesting products that evolve, understand the customer space, and then provide the pre-sales and post-sales support for it. It's impossible. It doesn't matter how big you are. It's impossible for any company to do that. And so I think, like, listen, if you're really worried about AWS commoditizing you, you're probably not investing enough in R&D and moving fast enough. It's just too tough for a company, having run one of these large organizations, to do that sort of thing.
I just want to pick up on that point and mention like the examples in past. Like I look at Hadoop as backing up. I think the most important thing, if you're thinking about working with a company that is pursuing an commercial open source model like Kong, is, hey, do I believe in the founders? Do I believe in the community and the sort of the vision they have for what they're trying to build? And are they going to stay ahead of the curve? Are they going to continue to innovate? At the end of the day, that is the single most important thing. I think what Martina's saying is, like, sure, there'll be some community on AWS that might use an old version of your product, but what are you doing for me lately, and where are you taking me as a customer? Whether I'm an open source user or a commercial user, where are you taking me in the future? And like, you can look at some of the companies that tried to commercialize around Hadoop and kind of got stuck, focusing on Hadoop, which, as a technology, like all technologies, has had its day. And, I would argue that some of those companies, if they had been more on the forefront of pushing for what was next, whether it be with Spark or Kafka or what have you, like, maybe some of those companies would be bigger and stronger than they are today. So to me, it has more to do with, are you building innovation into your model? Are you staying on top of where the market is going and really leading the market? And if you have that kind of culture, and I think Kong does, you heard about a lot of it this morning, and obviously I'm biased as an investor in the company, but to me, that's the most important question, not, oh gosh, could AWS develop a competing service?
I totally agree, by the way. Totally agree.
It's like me against them here. Okay, one last question. We only have 1 second left. But so clearly, community is important. Developers are making a lot of buying decisions. Empowering the developer is important when it goes right. Are there any instances on the boards that you sit at, or examples you can share, where the goal was to empower the developer to make the buying decision, and it just never got there? And why did that happen, and how can the people in the room avoid that?
All right, we got to put you on the hot seat, Anna. You were heavily involved with Twilio, and they clearly connected the dots super well with the developer and dollars. How did they do it? Why do you think they were so successful?
Yeah, I think with Twilio, which is a little different from some of the projects we were talking about here, it never was any other buyer but the developer. And so I wouldn't say it was an easier community to build, but if you did that 5-minute demo, which they were very famous for, you would literally put in a line of code and your phone would ring. And it was something so simple and magical as that, where the developer was sort of sold in 5 minutes, and they made the decision because they were building the app with that component in it. And so I think Twilio never, until sort of the very end before they went public, had to make that decision of getting across to multiple layers in the organization. And SendGrid was similar. It was that sort of line of code and the email is sent. But I think some of the other founders that I've worked with, that connection is not as easy. You think you empower the developer, and yet there are multiple layers of organization that you still have to power through.
And pricing model, I would guess, is pretty important there as well if you're going to try to appeal to a developer, because they only have so much authority with respect to budget.
Yeah, but again, I think the budget for Twilio in the beginning, because it's very much the usage-based model, that was sort of the Trojan horse in, which I think helped that particular company. But again, I think it was an anomaly of sorts. Martin, anything to add back? Awesome. Well, I hope that was helpful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.